and I want to take the time to welcome all of you to today's session. And to kind of get us started, today's program is going to have some significant differences from previous presentations on debit card resolution. Unlike conversations regarding compliance or strictly Visa MasterCard rules, which provide discussion and clarification of some of the complex rules and regulations that we have to follow, fraud prevention is a far more subjective topic. There's no regulation that mandates that we have to have a fraud prevention program, or if we do, what it must contain. Certainly from a safety and soundness perspective, it's a wise recommendation to have one, but there's really no have-tos in today's conversation. Personally, I like rigid procedures. Here's the goal. Step 1, Step 2, and this is where we're going to get to. When I was putting together my own fraud prevention program at my institution, I often had questions. We'd go to our processor and say, what are other banks that you service seeing? How do you recommend that we proceed to handle this outbreak of fraud? And we were told, we're going to give you the tools and teach you how to use them from a technical aspect. It's going to be up to you to decide how to apply them to your situation. Now, everyone listening today, of course, comes from a different financial institution, different demographic, different geography. So the fraud that I've seen may or may not parallel with what you have experienced. What we do have in common is the threat of loss due to fraud. So my goal for today is to provide some suggestions that you may be able to apply to your individual situation and hopefully offer some resources that I've found helpful in my personal crusade against fraud loss and make it more difficult for the bad guys to impact our bottom lines. Now, before we can get into preventing fraud, we first have to take a look at how fraud has evolved, examine the methods used to steal card data that's ultimately used to drain our customers' accounts. We will look at what types of transactions the crooks have been favoring, as well as look a little bit at the Visa MasterCard rules regarding recovery to determine which transaction types present the greatest risk of loss to the bank. I have a few real-world case studies as well as Reg E investigation examples that we will explore from start to finish. And we're going to conclude our day by looking at some of those prevention options. At the 1 hour mark, we're going to try to break for 5 minutes, and as Andy had said, following that break time, I am going to take the opportunity to answer some of the questions that you've submitted during the presentation. During the presentation, I am going to be referencing some notes and some visuals in your written materials, so I do encourage you to keep those handy if you have printed them. There's no doubt how serious debit card fraud is, but just in case anyone's not sure, the Federal Reserve had conducted a survey in 2010 in advance of issuing its proposal for Reg II, which the CFPB finalized in 2011 to comply with the provisions of Dodd-Frank on interchange income. The purpose of the survey was to decide if an adjustment to the maximum interchange rate should be made to reward those institutions that spend extra money on fraud prevention. The results of that survey are quite sobering. In 2009, the estimated losses relating to debit card fraud were $1.34 billion. The survey included not only financial institutions, but also merchant losses. Not surprisingly, 80%, or $1.11 billion of those reported losses were attributed to signature debit card purchases. The remaining 20%, $181 million, were attributed to PIN-based purchases. Now, the most common complaint that I do hear from financial institutions is that we're always on the short end of fraudulent transactions. Reg E protects the consumer, Visa and MasterCard protects the merchant, or so the story goes. Now, in looking at those statistics, there is some truth to this. Of that $1.34 billion, 38% of it, or $509 million, of those losses were borne by the merchants. So clearly the majority of the fraud losses did fall on us. The report also confirms what we will look at in a few minutes with respect to the transactions that present the highest risks to us. Institutions lost 96% of the time that the transaction was made using a PIN. The merchant lost 74% of the transactions made in a card not present or non-face-to-face environment. Before we look at the technological side of fraud, we have to make sure that we do not overlook some of the older but still very effective means of gaining card information. For example, and I'm going to call this fraud BC, or before computers. First up is the old-fashioned shoulder surfer. You have a customer that uses an ATM or PIN pad at a merchant location, and meanwhile the person next in line is leaning over to just get a glimpse of the PIN number as it's being entered. Now, I had a little fun with Microsoft Clip Art in providing your visual materials. So in the picture, we have a man in line, and he's apparently just innocently checking his watch. Actually, he could be glancing down at the PIN pad. Now, for this reason, of course, many of our ATMs and store PIN pads do come with a protective covering to try to shield the pad from view. Now, while this may seem a relatively low-tech crime, there are organized rings that still utilize this method as a means to hit several cards. On multiple occasions, I have had groups of customers. They've gone to various drinking establishments and nightclubs. I've specifically seen this in Chicago and New Orleans. You have loud, crowded nightclubs. They've got an ATM right on the premises for customers that need to get cash. And unfortunately, our customers probably already had a few beverages. They probably aren't the most aware of their surroundings. As a result, it's not that difficult for a group of two individuals to work this room. One hangs out by the ATM, kind of maybe even have a drink on the top of the ATM, who knows, but they're just kind of looking over, seeing the PIN number. Meanwhile, another one's waiting a few feet away so that as the customer is putting their pocketbook back into their pants, they bump into them, grab the wallet, grab the card, and then they've got a card number, they've got a PIN number, and they've got an easy means to steal from your customer and ultimately from you. Now, if the crooks aren't interested in trying to get the PIN, they can still certainly do plenty of damage simply by stealing the physical card. Again, they target busy individuals who leave the card information readily accessible. In the next picture, we've got a working mom. She's got her briefcase under one arm, a bag of groceries in the other, her purse held with one hand. If she can be distracted, leans down to help the kids that are screaming, whatever the situation, the crooks reach in, and they will actually take her wallet and leave the purse. I had a customer who was shopping downtown Chicago, and she received a call on her cell phone from our fraud detection unit, and they asked her if she had made a $900 purchase in Chicago. She said no, she hadn't. The purchase attempt happened to be in the same store that she was standing. It was only then that she discovered that her wallet had been taken from her purse. It amazes me the number of people that still leave their purses and wallets in their car. Oh, it'll be fine. The doors are locked. I'll only be gone for a few minutes. And then they come out to a broken car window and an empty bank account. We've also heard the saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. And this couldn't be more true in the case of the dumpster diver. Now, even in today's society where ID thieves lurk everywhere, customers continue to throw away their valuable information into the trash. Now, in these first three examples, the crooks only steal one card at a time. Occasionally, organized crime will attempt to have individuals get jobs at a merchant location where they can then harvest the card numbers that they've processed. Generally, once this information is taken, it may be held for several months prior to being used to give the insider the opportunity to terminate employment and hopefully avoid suspicion. Finally, the criminal mastermind may be closer to home than you could possibly think, or even in the home. We have a picture of one big happy family, but in the case of friendly fraud or not so friendly fraud, any one of them could be a suspect in a debit card theft case. I've had kids steal from parents. I've had siblings steal from each other. I've had boyfriend steal from girlfriend, and even a few occasions of parents stealing from kids. As an example, I had a case of friendly fraud. We had a customer in her early 20s filed a claim for fraudulent ATM withdrawals and debit card purchases. She reported that her card was missing from her wallet. Now, since the transactions all involved the use of her PIN, of course we asked her, have you ever loaned your card to anyone? Is there anyone who could possibly have known your PIN number? Oh, no, I've never given the card to anyone. I don't know how this could have possibly happened. Now, ironically, the same day she filed her claim, her card was turned in at one of our branches. a young man found the card in the parking lot and brought it in. It just so happened that one of the fraudulent ATM withdrawals happened to be done at that same branch where the card was turned in. So I pulled the surveillance of that ATM. I had a partial shot of a young man in an orange shirt trying to hide his face from the camera. Well, this got me thinking. The branch staff said the card had been brought into the branch, so I pulled the branch tapes. We had a young man in an orange shirt handing the card to the teller. Well, now I've got a face, but I have no idea who my suspect is. As part of my investigations, I always like to go back and take a look at some of the transactions when my customer did have the card in their possession. So I happened to go back to the last valid ATM withdrawal that the young lady had performed. Much to my surprise, that same young man happened to be sitting in the passenger seat with my customer in the driver's seat. So I printed some pictures and called her in. She showed up with her older brother, who I'm sure was there to keep me from taking advantage of his sister. After her initial shock of seeing the pictures, of course, the next thing is denial. But he couldn't have done this. He called Dad at work from home that morning at 10:30, so it had to have been someone else. It's got to be just a coincidence. Well, I walked her through the activity. The PIN purchases had been done about 9 o'clock, and the ATM withdrawal followed by the card being turned in at 11 o'clock. The kid clearly got up, made the purchases, went back home to establish an alibi by making that phone call, and then came back for one more round of cash before deciding to turn the card in. How could we ever suspect him?